Alors, j'aimerais souhaiter la bienvenue à tous et toutes pour la prochaine. Nous allons passer la prochaine heure et demie ensemble en compagnie de Seth Klein, l'auteur de A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency, ainsi que d'un panel qui sera composé de Marie-Josée Parent, Karel Méran et Claude Vachet. Pour débuter la présentation, je vais d'abord vous présenter Annie Bérubé. Alors, Annie a passé la majorité de sa carrière comme attachée politique et conseillère en politique environnementale à Ottawa, sur la colline parlementaire au sein du bureau du vérificateur général du Canada, ainsi que pour Environnement et Santé Canada. Annie a également travaillé au think tank Smart Prosperity à l'Université d'Ottawa, ainsi qu'aux relations gouvernementales pour l'organisme Équiterre. Annie s'est jointe à la Fondation McConnell en 2019 comme directrice de programme axée sur la transition vers une économie carboneutre. Annie, je vous cède le micro.
Bonjour Diane, bonjour à tous et bienvenue. Eh bien, je suis seulement ici aujourd'hui pour vous souhaiter la bienvenue au nom de mes collègues à la Fondation McConnell. Je me joins à vous aujourd'hui d'Ottawa, en territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple Anishinaabe-Algonquin. Et vraiment, on n'aurait pas pu imaginer un moment plus opportun pour avoir cette importante conversation avec Seth Klein sur la mobilisation essentielle pour faire face à la crise climatique. Pendant que la Californie brûle, on en ressent les impacts sur la côte ouest canadienne. Et ici à Ottawa, on entendait les intervenants aujourd'hui en Cour suprême qui défendaient la tarification carbone. Le mouvement citoyen, le mouvement des jeunes se poursuit toujours en mobilisation. Vous vous rappellerez que ça fait juste un an qu'on était 1,5 million de personnes dans la rue à Montréal, rassemblées avec Greta Thunberg. Eh bien, ce mouvement jeunesse-là, il est toujours en vie malgré les restrictions de la pandémie et se poursuit en ligne. Donc, je vous inviterai à aller voir les organismes et les activités en ligne ce vendredi, grand vendredi de mobilisation jeunesse pour l'action climatique au Canada. Il me fait plaisir de vous présenter la prochaine intervenante, Madame Désirée McGrath. Désirée est montréalaise d'origine. Elle vient tout juste de rentrer à Montréal après avoir terminé son poste en tant que directrice du Collège Pearson, le Collège du Monde-Uni en Colombie-Britannique. Désirée est également une des fondatrices du projet de formation Réalité climatique Canada qui est instigé par l'ancien vice-président Al Gore aux États-Unis et qui, depuis 2007, a rejoint et a formé des dizaines de milliers de Canadiennes et de Canadiens face à l'urgence climatique. Et je crois comprendre que Désirée est une bonne amie de Seth Klein. Alors, qui mieux pour le présenter ce soir? Désirée, à toi la parole.
Merci Annie et bonjour à tous et à toutes. J'ai le privilège de vous présenter aujourd'hui le conférencier principal, c'est-à-dire Seth Klein, que je connais depuis que nous sommes ados, grandissant ici à Montréal. How do you introduce someone who has accomplished so much in the 30-plus years you've known them? Seth Klein, of course, as you know, is an author, an advocate, an educator, and one of Canada's leading progressive policy analysts. For 22 years, he served as the founding BC director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, where he remains a research associate while also serving as an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, where he makes his home with his spouse, Vancouver City Councillor Christine Boyle, their young and beautiful son, Aaron, and Seth's daughter, Zoe. Not only is Seth a devoted father and partner, he is a beloved son to award-winning NFB filmmaker Bonnie Cher Klein, groundbreaking family medical doctor Michael Klein, and brother to best-selling author and icon Naomi Klein. What you may not fully appreciate about Seth is that he comes to the climate emergency with deep, indeed decades-long experience in mobilizing Canadians around the greatest challenges of our time. I first met Seth when I was 15, when I joined a group that he co-founded called SAGE, Students Against Global Extermination. Keeping in mind this was the late 80s, around the Cold War. This was a Montreal-based group that did high school presentations about the threat of nuclear war and what young people could do to prevent it. Based on growing interest in our peer-to-peer model of engaging fellow youth, Seth, myself, and 2 other Montreal teens took a year off school and took the show on the road, traveling from Newfoundland to British Columbia, reaching hundreds of high school students and high schools across the country. Our big lesson from the SAGE experience is that one cannot scare people into effective action, because fear-mongering leads to anger and apathy. To inspire action, Seth understands the need to empower and equip citizens with the tools and attitudes to make a difference. Seth is what I call a practical idealist. He knows that people need a sense of purpose, powerful role models, and examples of positive change. And above all, they need a plan. And that's what Seth is all about. He is the man with the plan. From addressing global warming to global warming, Seth has applied these formative lessons throughout his career and into his book, A Good War. Seth demonstrates that while the reality of climate change can be cause for intellectual pessimism, we have an obligation to be operationally optimistic. That is to act as if there is hope and to make that our future. I am so proud of you, Seth, and I am so grateful to you for challenging all of us to step up and fight the climate emergency, to fight a good war that we must and we will win. Merci.
Merci, merci Désirée, merci Annie. Je me rends compte que j'étais tellement enthousiaste de commencer cet événement que j'ai oublié de me présenter. Donc, je vais le faire avant de commencer l'entretien avec Seth. Mon nom est Diane Bérard, je suis journaliste de Solutions. Et maintenant, nous allons nous tourner vers Seth. Hi, Seth.
Hello, everybody. Nice to be with you. Thank you, all of you who are on this webinar, for your interest in the book. I just want to say a special thanks to Desiree. It's very special to be introduced by somebody who I cut my political teeth with as a teenager. It means a lot. And I also just want to say a special thank you to the McConnell Foundation, not only for hosting this event, but for being one of the key supporters of my book when I was doing the actual research. It really wouldn't have happened without them. And as Annie also said, I'm coming to you from Vancouver, which means I'm coming to you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And it may feel, you know, on a virtual event a bit odd to make these land acknowledgements, but in the book, I try to make the case for why the assertion of Indigenous rights and title is actually key to winning this fight. Nice to be with you, Diane.
Thank you, Seth. I love the fact that Desiree described you as a practical idealist, because in my bio, I describe myself as a pragmatic dreamer. So I think that there's a meeting of the mind somewhere.
Let's do it.
So let's start with the first question. Let's talk about Quebec. There's this good news, bad news story about Quebec perspective on climate change action. And Quebec has the strongest level of support for bold climate action. But that being said, something else comes after. So tell us about the bad news, good news stories of Quebec.
Sure. I think it is a mixed story, as you say. Well, let's build out the good news for a bit. As part of my research for the book, I actually commissioned a major national opinion poll from Abacus Research. And as you say, there is strong support across the country, in fact, for bold climate action, but it is strongest in the province of Quebec. And the civil society mobilization really, by a long stretch, is strongest in Quebec. Annie mentioned off the top, a year ago, there were the student strikes, by far and away the largest in Montreal. And at the municipal level, we have 400 odd Quebec municipalities that have declared climate emergency motions, which is more than the rest of the country combined. So that's all good news. And of course, in a practical level, when we think about greenhouse gas emissions, Quebec is starting from an enviable position compared to other provinces because of your electricity base and hydro. So Quebec is responsible for 11% of Canada's GHG emissions. You compare that to Alberta, with a smaller population, is responsible for 38% of Canada's emissions. But I would say, you know, if I'm asked, does the government of Quebec, are they acting like it's an emergency? And my answer would be no. first of all, when you look at GHG emissions, and maybe there's a slide that I'm hoping can get called up that looks at both Canada and Quebec's GHG emissions. There we go. So the larger bars there are Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back to the last 20 years. And to me, this is a deeply disturbing chart because what it communicates is that on the core challenge of our time, everything we have been doing is not working. The best you can say is that we have flattened the curve, but we have not bent the curve. And in the yellow, you see Quebec's emissions, which are obviously a smaller share of the country, but there too, you see a little bit of drop in Quebec emissions between 2004 and 2014, and then it's basically flatlined. In fact, in the latest year, they're up again. So the approach we're taking isn't working, and a big piece of what I'm arguing in the book is what emergency measures need to actually look like. So for example, take zero emission vehicles. So Quebec has one of the most positive policies on that in the country. You know, there's rebates for people who buy electric vehicles, there are exemptions from the bridge tolls. That's all well and good, but it misses the point of an emergency. In an emergency, we don't make things voluntary. We don't just incentivize change, we mandate change. Same with buildings, right? It's one thing to encourage people to change their heating sources, but in an emergency, we would say, next year, no new buildings would be able to tie into natural gas lines for heating, right? That's what it looks and feels like to treat it as an emergency.
Ici. Avant de passer à la prochaine question, j'aimerais rappeler aux participants qu'il existe un service d'interprétation. Vous allez dans votre barre d'outils en bas du Zoom et vous sélectionnez le globe terrestre. À ce moment-là, on va vous demander de choisir la langue que vous préférez, donc le français ou l'anglais. Vous avez le choix. Si vous le mettez sur Mute Original Audio, vous allez seulement entendre la langue de votre choix. Si vous le laissez sur Manage Language Interpretation, vous allez quand même entendre un 20% de discours dans la langue d'origine. For those in English, you will get some English instruction in the chat if you want to have the translation in French. Voilà. Seth, I'd like to talk about mindset because in the book, I love the fact that you talk about an emergency mindset. You see, we have to there's a need for this emergency mindset. You talked about the fact that the government has to mandate, not just inciter. So how does that translate on the ground, that emergency mindset, and how different is it from the past mindset? Because there's been a little scale, like we are more worried than we used to be, but we're not in this emergency mindset.
Yes, no, we're not. Although interestingly, you know, it's an ironic bit of timing that I wrote my entire book before the pandemic. I shipped it off for final copy edit 3 days before the pandemic. I thought, you know, my whole book is structured around lessons from the Second World War, which we treated as an emergency. And I thought we needed this historic reminder of what that looks like and what becomes possible. Now, of course, we've all been living through that in real time. And the pandemic gives you a sense of, yes, this is what it looks and feels and sounds like when a government treats an emergency as an emergency. There are daily briefings. We invoke emergency measures as if necessary. We control supply chains in order to ensure necessary things get produced. We strike emergency cabinet committees to oversee all of this work. That's what it looks and sounds and feels like. And it stands in such stark contrast to the more lackadaisical approach we've seen with respect to the climate emergency. In the case of the climate emergency, the messaging has been much more confused and contradictory, right? So our federal government will pass a climate emergency motion one day and reapprove the Trans Mountain Pipeline the very next day. That's confusing to people. That's confusing to the public. And it's incoherent from a policy point of view, and the math doesn't work on it. So what does it look like? So what happens with an emergency mindset is things that seemed politically possible become possible. It liberates a kind of new sense of shared purpose, a new sense of national unity around a shared project. Again, like we're seeing in the pandemic, it liberates governments from an austerity mindset. You know, interestingly, just today in the throne speech, we heard that now is not the time for austerity, but they were talking correctly about COVID, but not yet about the climate emergency. So a piece of operationalizing that is, as I said before, you shift from incentivizing and encouraging change to mandating change with clear timelines. You also spend what you have to spend to win. That's what we're doing with COVID. That's what we did in the war. Incidentally, with all of the, you know, we're going to have a very large deficit this year with COVID. It doesn't hold a candle to what we did in the Second World War. And you create the new economic institutions that you need to get the job done. So, for example, in the war, I know I'm kind of like people's weird uncle talking about the war all the time, but I'm going to give you an example. The cabinet minister in the Mackenzie King government who oversaw wartime production in World War II was a guy named C.D. Howe. He was no lefty, by the way. You know, he was on the right wing of the Liberal Party, but he was seized with what had to happen. He was happy to give contracts to the private sector to expedite, but anytime they couldn't quickly do what he needed done, he created a new crown corporation to expedite that military production. He created 28 crown corporations during the war to get that job done.
So do you see the creation of new crown corporation for this climate crisis? What kind of corporation would you imagine?
One piece of it, yes. So for just by way of contrast, first of all, the Justin Trudeau government has created 2 crown corporations in its time in office so far, one of which is the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. So what would we do if we were to try to replicate what C.D. Howe did? First of all, you take an inventory of everything that we need. How many electric buses, how many electric heat pumps, how many solar arrays, how many wind farms. And then you survey the production landscape and you say, what do we need, what do we have, and what do we need? And in order to fill the gap, you either contract with the private sector, or if it can't happen fast enough, we do it ourselves. And we would create, I personally, so my book has a 3-page list of possible new generation crown corporations. But to give you one example, electric heat pumps. I just converted my whole home this year off of natural gas onto electric heat pumps. It's expensive. It's more expensive than it needs to be. If we had a crown corporation utility that was mass producing and installing electric heat pumps, taking out the profit margin, getting the economies of scale, we could shave thousands of dollars off of that job. So that's one example. High-speed rail corporation, another example. A huge retrofit corporation at the municipal level.
Do you think we give enough incentive, or not incentive, but enough attention to all that retrofitting of buildings? Because we talk a lot about electric cars, about transportation, but I don't feel that there's that much energy about retrofitting or that much interest. Is it less sexy? Why don't we talk about retrofitting?
It's true that retrofitting is not sexy, but it is very important. The throne speech today mentioned it, which is good, but there too, so far, we incentivize change.
That's it.
If you want to do this kind of energy efficiency retrofit, we'll give you a rebate. Okay. That's not emergency.
You would mandate retrofitting?
Yes. So exactly. So first of all, and by the way, while it's true that it's good to make our buildings more and homes more efficient, goal now, and we're told they're going to legislate this, is to get to carbon zero. Now to get to carbon, you can't achieve carbon zero through energy efficiency. You can only achieve carbon zero by fuel swapping, meaning actually turning off the gas lines to our homes and replacing it with electric. What I think, and actually this is, Desiree mentioned my wife is a Vancouver City Councillor who introduced Vancouver's climate emergency motion a year and a half ago, which was the first in English Canada. And as part of their climate plan, in 1 year, no new buildings will be able to use natural gas for heating. As of 2025, any building of any age, when the furnace or hot water boiler goes, you won't be able to replace it with gas. That's what I mean. You've got to mandate it.
But there's a big barrier to this emergency mindset, and it's something called the new climate denialism. I'd like you to because you talk about it a lot in your book, define what this new climate denialism looks like and how it's in the way. Because it's very sneaky.
Well, it's sneaky, but it's ubiquitous in
Yes.
in many ways. So I define this as I think one of, if not the principal barrier to transformative change that's now needed. So what do I mean by that? Traditionally, we think of climate denialism, we think of Donald Trump or Maxime Bernier, just deny the reality of scientific human-induced climate change. The good news on that front is that the share of public opinion that believes that is a diminishing rump. Much more insidious is what I call the new climate denialism. And the new climate denialism, and I think it's practiced by almost all of our governments, federally and provincially, across the political spectrum, is to say you get it and accept the science, but continue to practice a policy agenda that does not align with what the science says we have to do. So to say we get the climate emergency, but continue to double down on the expansion of the tar sands, that's the new climate denialism. In my province, to say we're going to have the most ambitious climate plan and also expand fracking and liquefied natural gas, that's the new climate denialism. And it's a very attractive message to the public.
How does it play on our mind, this double way of acting, saying one thing, acting another thing? How does it play?
Well, the problem is that it's very attractive to the public. The core message from our governments has been, you don't have to choose, right? We can get serious about climate without sacrificing anything.
So it's reassuring. It's reassuring, yeah.
And so, we end up, one of the problems that I also speak of in the book is that while the public is ready for bold action, the level of basic climate literacy in Canada is terrible. Only about half of the public identifies that the main source of climate change is the burning of fossil fuels. Now, that speaks to a failure of leadership. It speaks to a failure on the part of the media, your domain, not you personally. But if that many people don't understand something as basic as that, we have not done a lot of work.
But speaking of the media, I might say that on the quantity of the reporting, I think there is a lot of reporting on climate change, climate crisis, but the problem is finding the right storytelling. And that media has a very hard time because there's a lot of information, but we haven't found the right storytelling. Scaring people doesn't work, making it too light doesn't work, making it too easy doesn't work, too hard doesn't. So the storytelling is very hard to find.
Well, so first of all, let me say two things about one about the media and one about the story. So on the story side, this is actually one of the things that I've enjoyed framing my book the way I have around the Second World War, which is that it allows me to tell a story that in the end is very hopeful. Because it is this historic, all of us who wonder, can we really do this? Is this job too big? We need hope, but what I love about our World War II story, where we completely retooled the economy, not once, but twice in the space of 6 years, once to ramp up military production, another to convert back to peacetime. For all of us who wonder, can we do this? The answer is yes, we can, because we've done it. So that becomes a hopeful story. And I tried to walk a line in the book. It's a very delicate line of not being Pollyanna, not being an ingenue about the severity of the crisis we face, and to tell the truth, but on the other hand, still have hope. But you say there's been more reporting on climate. It has gotten better in the last couple of years, but it's nowhere near where it needs to be. The media, even like Annie spoke of the example which we've been living with in Vancouver from the smoke, but the fires in the Western United States. A tiny fraction of the media stories connect the dots back to climate change. And that's been true for years. I mean, I look at say CBC, where you are, Radio Canada. So Radio Canada, CBC actually had a really important role to play in mobilizing the public in the Second World War. Fortunately, the CBC had been created 3 years before the war and now could reach Canadians. And you contrast that with today, every morning on my CBC radio, I get hourly business reports, I get hourly sports reports. surely I could have a morning climate emergency report. And that's what we did in the war. It wasn't a TV service then, it was just radio, but in English Canada at least, the voice of CBC Nightly News was this guy, Lorne Greene. Mm-hmm. Now, many people know him because he went on to become a famous Hollywood actor from Bonanza and Battlestar Galactica. But in the Second World War, he was affectionately known as the voice of doom. Every night he told us what had to happen, and it was a combination of fear and hope.
But you know what's the big difference, and you say it in your book also, but who's the enemy? You see, in World War II, the enemy was so clear. So mobilizing people against this enemy was not easy, but it was a clear path. Now it's very tough. I can say as a reporter, who's the enemy and how do you identify the enemy?
Yeah.
And if you want people to go fight a good war, you need a good enemy. So how do you work on that part? Mm-hmm.
So a few things on this. One, I would point out that in this fight against COVID, the enemy is much more, it's hard to get your head around. And it's not as clear as it was, say, when it was the Nazis in World War II. But I actually want to press back on the historic record here. It's funny that you should say this, Diane, because when I started to tell people about the book project, very often people would say, yes, but in the Second World War, everyone understood the threat to be clear and present, as you just said. Except that's not true. It wasn't clear and present to Canadians. It was on the other side of two oceans. And this was not a public that was keen to go back into a world war, especially in Quebec, nor was it a leadership that wanted to go back to war. The Mackenzie King government desperately did not want to do this. Right, even though on the cusp of our society being completely transformed, right up until the 11th hour, this was a government that did not want to do this, and that was still in their own form of threat denial. Mackenzie King actually met with Hitler and dismissed him as no serious threat.
So you think that we can make this war this climate war real in the mind of people?
Yes, I do. And I think it takes leadership is my point.
So we go back to this mandate.
It took work on the part of the government to bring the public where they needed to go and to ultimately, it's extraordinary in the end, out of a population base of a little over 11 million people at the time. Over 1 million Canadians enlisted in World War II, but it did not happen right away. It took work to get people there.
J'en profite, on est à la moitié de la conversation avec Seth pour vous dire que si vous avez des questions à mesure qu'on discute, que vous pouvez voir la pensée de Seth évoluer, je vous invite à poser des questions dans le chat, donc dans l'onglet de conversation. Les questions vont toutes être retenues, sauf qu'on va en garder 2 pour poser à Seth. Les autres vont être gérées plus tard, puis vous aurez des réponses par courriel. So I'd like to go back to the private sector, Seth, the role of the private sector in this climate crisis. I'm an economic reporter. I deal with the private sector. I've interviewed tons of CEOs. What are they supposed to do in this climate crisis? And because I'm not sure they feel it's their job. So how do you see it?
Well, there is an important role for the private sector, just as there was in the Second World War in rising to the climate emergency. But part of what I am trying to argue in the book is to disabuse people of the idea that the private sector can actually lead us in what we need to do. As in the war,
it won't be able because it won't want to, because it's not their role. Why?
Because it's too voluntary. Because it's too voluntary.
Okay.
It has to be state-led and mandated, as I described. So let me, if I may, let me go back to that World War II story. So the private sector played a very important role in this incredible buildup of armaments. So, and just let's appreciate this for a moment. From a base of almost nothing, in 6 years, Canada produced about 750 big ships, 16,000 military aircraft, ultimately creating the fourth largest air force in the world. 800,000 military vehicles, more than Japan, Germany, and Italy combined, from a base of nothing. And the private sector had a huge role to play. But what the private sector wasn't allowed to do is to determine the allocation of scarce resources, because in an emergency, that's not what you do. So instead, what C.D. Howe did is he controlled all of the key input supply chains: machine tools, rubber, silk, coal, fuel, timber, and to prioritize military production. What he then did is he actually recruited a whole bunch of his friends from the private sector to head up those crown corporations I mentioned before, and to serve as controllers of those supply chains that I just mentioned. In fact, over 100 of them served in that role as what were called dollar-a-year men during the Second World War. So the private sector played a big role, but for many of those leaders, interestingly, what they actually did is abandon their post in the private sector and moved over temporarily to the public sector in order to do what needed to be done. And I should say, there was a fascinating little story I stumbled across during my research about McConnell himself. I want to share because McConnell Foundation is hosting us. So John McConnell was, by the time World War II came, he had recently founded this foundation. He was one of the richest men in the country. He was actually asked to be one of these dollar-a-year men, but he politely declined. He was quite elderly at this point. He was very sensitive to any perception, and this is interesting, around the pandemic, right? Because we see many corporations profiting during the pandemic. He was very sensitive to a perception that he would be guilty of that. And he took, his biggest asset was the St. Lawrence Sugar Company in Montreal. He basically took all of the profits of that sugar company for the duration of the war and plowed it instead into this foundation that's hosting us today. That's what capitalized a bunch of this. Was the point in this story is that the way the private sector responded to that emergency is on a scale that we have not seen anything like when it comes to the climate emergency.
But if we look at the climate emergency, what we're telling most of the enterprise, most of the private sector is you have to stop doing something. You have to invest, so you stop do something and do something else. And yes, we say it's a business opportunity. We say there's a new Green Deal, but basically a lot of private sector has to stop do something and find something else to do. So it's not a very mobilizing proposition to tell them, you know, because of this crisis, we're not asking for your help. We're asking you to stop doing something because you're messing up. What you're doing is messing up. So there's this discourse about business opportunity, but to be very honest, on the ground, for many companies, it's not a business opportunity. It's a life-threatening moment, a soul-searching moment.
It depends on the company.
Yeah, that's it.
So for example, in the pandemic, we have seen some companies say, hey, what we do can be there's craft beer companies that are making vats of the hand sanitizer and things like that. So you shift to meet the
But there are some who stopped doing everything because they were not useful at all.
Right. And then there's a whole bunch of companies that are neutral in this, but that still have to, I mean, part of the mandates that I spoke of earlier is that every institution, including every private sector institution of any notable size, is going to have to develop and present what is your fossil fuel wind down plan for the next 10 to 20 years. And you know, that's what we're going to need to see. There are some companies that are explicitly in the fossil fuel industry that are in fact on a path for wind down, and that is their existential threat. And I'm not that concerned about those companies, frankly. I'm more concerned about those workers. And that's where the government has to make a real and meaningful offer, particularly in those parts of the country that have the most heavy lifting to do, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland in particular. And I actually think there should be a new federal transfer called the Climate Emergency Just Transition Transfer. But instead of allocating it based on population, we would allocate it based on current GHGs. So if Alberta's currently 38% of GHGs, they get 38% of the money, but I wouldn't send it to Jason Kenney because he's not to be trusted on this. I think we actually should have just transition agencies in every province.
Well, there's a lot of discussion in Quebec about just transition. A lot of workers' fund who are taking the lead for this discussion. So yes, this is a concern here. And I think this idea might be interesting of a transition fund, yeah.
And it's a little easier in Quebec because all of those industries that are currently emitting, the technology for the most part exists for them to actually switch to non-GHG emission technologies. It's much harder when your core business is the production and extraction of those fossil fuels.
Let's go with the last discussion on inequalities, because we know that climate change fuels inequalities and inequalities fuel climate change. So it's a two-way street. So how does solving climate crisis will solve inequalities? Is there a possibility that if we go through that crisis and come shining on there's sun on the other side, that maybe inequalities will be lessened?
Yes, there is.
How?
So first of all, these things have to be linked. There are some climate policy purists out there who very much object to linking climate action with tackling inequality and other social justice issues. And you know, their argument is, don't make this any more complicated. Climate's hard enough as it is. And I respectfully think they're wrong. And they're wrong for a few reasons. First of all, they're wrong for the reason you just said. The two things are intimately connected because the wealthier have much higher emissions and lower income people are hardest hit, including by climate actions themselves. So we need to mitigate that. But here's the main reason why they need to be linked. And it's because that's how we win. In the polling I referred to before, you know, I asked people about a bunch of bold climate actions. I found strong support. And then I asked people, well, would your support go up or down if we tried to particularly, if we accompanied that by increasing taxes on the wealthy and corporations, increasing transfers to lower income people, offering a good jobs guarantee to fossil fuel workers. When you do that, the support doesn't go down, it goes through the roof. And this is the appeal of the Green New Deal, of linking these issues. It becomes that much more popular when we link it this way. And by the way, that was true in the war as well. You asked before, well, how do you mobilize public opinion? A key thing that the federal government realized in World War II is that, you know, in the early days, they just had these kind of classic propaganda, you know, go get Hitler. You know, that works to a point. But what they realized, particularly as of like 1942, is that it wasn't enough. If you were actually going to get hundreds of thousands of people to enlist voluntarily, offer up their lives, you had to make them a promise about the kind of society they were going to come back to. And so unemployment insurance is introduced in 1940. The family allowance is introduced in 1944. The whole architecture of the modern welfare state is written during World War II and offered up as a promise back. That's how you get everyone on the bus.
So you think that if we should talk more about inequalities and climate change, that would help popular support?
Yes, and interestingly, you know, I often, again, when I would tell people I'm working on this book, people would sometimes say, oh, well, we were a much more cohesive society back then. Well, actually, no, we weren't. When you measure inequality in Canada, and you measure how much income is going to the wealthiest 1%, you look back over the last 100 years, the year in which there was the most income inequality measured that way was 1938, the year before the war. After the war, you see this strong redistribution. So we didn't actually go into the war particularly socially cohesive. That social solidarity was forged in the doing. And we did it not just through mobilizing to fight, but also by, you know, corporate taxes in the Second World War increased from 18 to 40%. We had an excess profits tax. So the kind of profiteering we've seen in this pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. And on the flip side, we had those new social programs. So, you know, that's how you do it.
If we talk about inequalities, we will talk about mitigation, because you talked a lot earlier about government has to mandate. Well, if he mandates, at some point it will have trickle-down effect on the poorest or people who are living the more inequalities. So there will be a lot of mitigation to do. You can't just put measures and then don't expect that some people will pay the price for those measures.
This is very important. I mean, I was hinting at this before, but let me be clear. Almost every climate action policy you can think of will increase energy prices in the short term. And it, you know, and as economists, in the language of economists, it has a regressive distributional impact, meaning lower income families feel are more impacted by that, which isn't a reason not to do it. We have to do it, but we have to do it eyes wide open and mitigate it.
That's often an excuse that is used. Say we can't do that because it will impact on the poorest. So it's one way of saying, you know, when you said earlier about a new state of mind and be open to say government saying, I can't do stuff I couldn't do before because it's a crisis. Right. Well, that's one very delicate area, because we always come up to the point where some politician from the opposition will say, no, it will impact the poorest, so we can't.
Yeah, or even worse, it will be perceived as elitist in some way, that this climate project, and it feeds this kind of sort of right-wing populist backlash that is often quite ugly. So, you know, my former colleagues at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives have modeled how to do this. How can you take a carbon tax, combine it with a dividend, a credit, and transform what would otherwise be a regressive tax into a progressive tax that actually redistributes income? These things can be fixed, but we have to do it consciously and deliberately.
And they have to be done at the same time. You have to announce the measure and the mitigation at the same time. You can't come up after with the mitigation, because then it's always a question of public adhesion and saying that will people go with it? They will if you come up with the whole picture. So it's a very complete strategy, from what I understand.
Absolutely, it has to be combined right up front. And I would say the same is true on the jobs front. You know, for many workers, these promises about just transition historically ring very hollow. They always are like this promise that never really materializes, which is why I developed this idea of the just transition transfer. It has to be real. It has to be billions of dollars, and that money has to be there on the table so people know it's real.
There was this worker fund in Quebec who did this. They went in many cities in Quebec to see how workers from the old economy feel. And there was this one man who says, I don't belong here anymore. I belong to the old economy. What am I good for now? And that was really a cry from the heart, like saying, I feel I don't belong anywhere now. So, and I guess many workers in the brown industries must feel like that they don't belong anywhere because there's this Green New Deal, green economy. And what about them? So I guess
it's an anxious time for a lot of people. We have to acknowledge that up front. My difficulty is that often I hear our leaders articulating it and therefore being defeatist about what we need to do. And this is where I come back to the World War II story, right? We were 11 million people. Over 1 million Canadians enlisted, and over 1 million Canadians were involved in military production. They all had to be trained up, and they all had to be reintegrated into a peacetime economy. That's far, far more people than are currently employed in those fossil fuel industries today, in a population that is more than 3 times as large as it was then. If we could do that then, with that level of ambition then, we can do it again. We did it then through income supports, through housing supports, through post-secondary training supports that changed the face of the post-secondary sector in the country for a generation and changed people's lives. We can do that again.
Well, on the day of the throne speech, we're giving a big agenda to the government. Now let's see what the people, the attendees think about this. Everything you said. Okay, so I have this first question for you, Seth. According to you, what are the 2 biggest communication challenges to massively embark individual citizen in climate positive action? So the 2 biggest communication challenges.
Well, as I was saying earlier, we need, as we had in World War II, we need a message that is ubiquitous and consistent Right now, we're getting confusing messages, right? When our government says, yes, climate emergency, but yes, expand the Trans Mountain Pipeline the next day, that's confusing. Even in the level of advertising, right? Why do we allow fossil fuel cars and gas stations to advertise? We don't allow it for tobacco because it's bad for your health. So if you're a young person and you're told it is an emergency, but you're still seeing all these ads, that's confusing. So that's part of it. We need something equivalent to the Wartime Information Bureau we had in the war, which is coordinating all of this. But the other piece out of that war experience was, it wasn't just that they made a promise to people during the war. They actually switched gears mid-war to have a conversation with Canadians about what kind of society we were going to come back to. And you know, there's so much scope for this. We have so many innovative ways of doing participatory engagement and so on, to invite people to say, okay, we have clarity on these mandated targets, but how we achieve it together remains an open question. Let's figure it out together.
So you're talking ubiquitous and you're talking participatory. Those are the two challenges I understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
And consistent.
And consistent. Next question. When there is such resistance and a sense of entitlement by car drivers against municipal initiatives like bike path, how can we hope that people will accept mandating?
This is what I mean by what becomes possible when we actually see an emergency as an emergency. I want to give you an example from the Second World War. The United States didn't enter the war until 2 years after we did, but they had some time to plan as a result. Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941. In February of 1942, 2 months later, in the United States of America, the center of car culture, the last civilian automobile came off the assembly line in Detroit, and for the next 4 years, the production and sale of the private automobile was basically illegal. I'm not saying we have to do quite that. I'm simply saying that remarkable things become possible when we actually treat something as an emergency.
Comes back to the emergency mindset. My last question, how do we deal with collective action problem globally? Even if Canada does all the right things, how can we make sure that big emitters also reduce their emission? What do you think about the idea, climate club of like-minded country working together using trade barriers as policy instrument?
Oh, I'm so glad this question came up. So first of all, of course, it's a global enterprise and we have to have that kind of international cooperation. Actually, one of the initiatives that I'm involved in is this initiative. It's a global initiative for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. People are going to be hearing more and more about it in the coming months. It's very new. But the idea is for all of these countries that are fossil fuel producers, including Canada, you know, everyone's caught in this prisoner's dilemma. No one wants to be a chump. Nobody wants to lower their own emissions only to have somebody else do it instead. And so can we have a treaty kind of modeled on the nuclear non-proliferation treaty where we cooperatively come down? So we do need things like that at an international level. But my book is written for Canadians. It's about what we have to do in our own domain. And we have to do it knowing that there are millions of people of goodwill around the world who are doing the same in their own countries. And it's often the case, again, when I've told people about this book when I was working on it, a very common refrain among Canadians is to say, oh, but we're a small country. What we do doesn't really matter. Look, it's true that our emissions relative to the US or Europe or China or India are small. Our per capita emissions are the worst in the world. And that doesn't even count what we extract and export that's burned somewhere else and counts towards somebody else's emissions conveniently. So we do have an important role to play.
We have a big impact,
And I want to come back to the war, as I always do. Here's what I love about our World War II story. Canada didn't require an attack on our own soil. We went to war 2 years before the United States. For a number of those first 2 years, we were the only country in the Western Hemisphere that was engaged in that war. We were only 11 million people. And at the end of it, nobody questioned the value and importance of what we had done.
I guess your image of Pearl Harbor struck has an impact. Is something like Pearl Harbor required to help push the good word of climate emergency? Our enemy comes to our shore in a more immediate way to get our lasting attention?
Good question. So again, you know, we don't always require an attack on our soil, but that said, in the book, I actually encourage us to rethink and reframe these extreme weather events as attacks on our soil. I actually specifically use that language. You know, these floods, these wildfires, these are our attacks on our soil. And back to the media, right? I mean, in World War II, Canadians every day in their newspaper saw a map, the map of the line and the advancement of the different forces. Let us see that map every day of these attacks on our soil. That's part of the communication.
Well, when there was the flood in Saint-Marthe-sur-le-Lac in Quebec, there was a lot of coverage in the news. We saw people who lost their home. We saw people struggling with insurance to get paid, people who didn't know they would, you know, build again on the same land. And it was very passionate about, do we build on the same land? Do we allow people to build back? So there was a lot of very emotional coverage. But I don't know 1 year later what's left of it, because at that time everybody was so into it, but one story chases the other.
Yeah, well, and that's what we need the media to do. In the poll I conducted for my research, I asked a question about whether or not you personally or someone close to you has experienced already the impacts of climate change. Now, I found very high yeses to that question. The lowest level of yes to that question was in Alberta, even though arguably Alberta has experienced the most examples of what we're talking about. But what happens in the political culture there and in the media culture there is it becomes verboten to connect the dots. It's somehow viewed as insensitive to those who are experiencing these events, and that needs to stop.
You have a personal story about that. Your book starts with your personal story about an extreme event. Maybe you can tell it to our participant.
Yeah, well, the book opens with this fire when I was with my wife and her family a couple summers ago, and where it was like a war scene all day long. It was helicopters and planes coming.
You were going to the cabin? You were trying to go to the cabin. What happened?
Well, it was a rental home in the Okanagan, and the fire was on the ridge behind us. And it was just like a scene from Apocalypse Now or something. Like, we literally were yelling over the sound of helicopters all day. But look, let me give you a more recent example. These fires on the west coast of the United States meant that all last week we were engulfed in smoke here in Vancouver. And so just as we were sending our children back to school, and we had been promised that the windows would be open and they would maximize the time the children spend outside, we were ordered to stay inside and close the windows. This is the convergence of the crises that we face.
Okay, Seth, now we will turn to French, and you will listen to the panel so you can react after. Merci beaucoup, Seth. Alors, nous allons passer au panel. On a 3 super panélistes avec nous aujourd'hui qui ont écouté mon entretien avec Seth et à qui je vais poser chacun une question. Donc, je vais vous nommer mes 3 panélistes et puis après ça, on va commencer avec, dans l'ordre, Marie-Josée Carrel et Claude. Donc, Marie-Josée Parent a été élue en 2017 conseillère municipale du district Champlain-Île-des-Sœurs dans l'arrondissement de Verdun. Elle siège actuellement au comité exécutif de la Ville de Montréal à titre de conseillère associée à la culture. Karel Méran est le PDG de la Fondation du Grand Montréal. Il a été directeur général pour le Québec et l'Atlantique de la Fondation David Suzuki entre 2008 et 2020 et président du conseil d'administration du projet de la réalité climatique d'Al Gore pour le Canada. Claude Vachey, quant à lui, est associé directeur chez Cycle Capital, un pionnier des fonds de capital de risque en technologie propre. Au cours des 30 dernières années, il a acquis une expérience opérationnelle en matière de technologie propre, entre autres dans le secteur de l'eau, de l'énergie et des déchets, ainsi que d'autres applications industrielles. Alors, je vais commencer avec Marie-Josée. Ma première question va porter sur le secteur municipal. Donc, Marie-Josée, j'aimerais savoir, on a vu des villes qui s'engagent pour le climat, pour lutter contre la crise climatique. Maintenant, à quoi ressemble le prochain palier, le prochain niveau d'intervention municipale dans le dossier de la crise climatique?
Oui, bonjour, bonsoir. Je vais d'abord commencer en reconnaissant qu'on est en territoire non cédé de la nation kenyenne Kehaka, que je remercie pour son hospitalité sur son territoire. Bon, pour répondre à la question, d'abord, j'aimerais dire que comme ville, on doit faire face à 3 grands enjeux. La lutte au changement climatique, la protection de la biodiversité et la mise en place de mesures d'adaptation aux nouvelles réalités climatiques. Les villes sont aux premières loges des impacts des enjeux climatiques. On en a parlé avec Seth il y a quelques minutes. Les ouragans en Nouvelle-Orléans, les feux de forêt dans l'Ouest américain qui affectent plusieurs villes, les inondations en 2019 à Montréal, par exemple, les chaleurs accablantes partout dans le monde, à Paris, à Montréal, dans plusieurs grandes villes, à New York. Ce sont souvent, quasiment tout le temps, les services d'urgence des villes qui réagissent en premier. Montréal, en 2019, a dû déclarer l'état d'urgence pour pouvoir lutter efficacement contre les inondations. Donc, ces enjeux-là ont des impacts majeurs sur nos opérations comme ville. Et on a le devoir, la responsabilité de se préparer aux feux de forêt, aux inondations à répétition, à l'augmentation des maladies dues à la pollution et aux prochaines pandémies parce qu'il risque d'en avoir d'autres. Dans ce contexte-là, nos espaces d'action ou d'intervention sont multiples et je pense que c'est important de le souligner. On peut agir sur notre territoire à différents niveaux et tous ces niveaux-là sont essentiels pour avoir une lutte active et une mobilisation efficace dans la lutte au changement climatique. Tous les plans d'urbanisme de toutes les villes devraient considérer les éléments que j'ai nommés, les feux de forêt, les inondations, enfin tous les impacts qui émergent des changements climatiques et des mesures qui font en sorte de pouvoir pas simplement s'adapter, mais aussi lutter efficacement contre les changements climatiques et réduire d'abord et avant tout les émissions de GES à l'échelle des villes. Comme ville, nos espaces d'action et notre pouvoir est limité. Il est encadré par des lois provinciales. Ça n'empêche qu'on a des capacités importantes d'amener des changements matériels, donc des changements qui transforment la ville et qui donc transforment aussi les façons de faire et en transformant les façons de faire, transforment les mentalités. Notre culture, notre façon d'agir est aussi construite en fonction de l'espace dans lequel on vit. Il influence notre façon d'être, notre façon d'interagir avec les autres et notre façon de penser. Notre rôle, c'est donc de contribuer à se sortir des actions individuelles en proposant des mesures à grande échelle qui facilitent la participation des citoyens à la construction d'une société carboneutre et résiliente. C'est aussi de créer un impact systémique en offrant des options viables aux citoyens pour se libérer de notre dépendance au pétrole. Donc, ce qu'on fait et ce qu'on doit amplifier de façon drastique, arrêter la destruction des espaces verts dans les territoires urbains, améliorer la protection de la biodiversité des milieux humides qui existent aussi en milieu urbain, commencer à parler de façon continue et soutenue de foresterie urbaine, planter des arbres, démultiplier les plantations d'arbres, se créer des forêts à l'intérieur des villes, augmenter de façon drastique le transport en commun. On l'a vu à Montréal, ce travail est en train de se faire avec le REM, avec les voies réservées pour les autobus, avec les acquisitions d'autobus hybrides, avec la STM qui électrifie sa flotte aussi. On doit se concentrer sur le transport actif et transformer l'espace urbain pour faciliter le transport actif, pour le rendre plus qu'accessible, pour le rendre sécuritaire, pour le rendre enviable, pour faire en sorte que les gens, les citoyens aient non seulement le goût, mais sentent que c'est un moyen de transport plus efficace, plus avantageux que ne l'est la voiture. Avec le réseau Express Vélo, par exemple, on est en train de construire 174 km de pistes cyclables sécurisées en site propre à Montréal. C'est énorme, mais on sait que ce travail-là devrait être amplifié dans le futur. On a aussi un impact sur un sujet peut-être moins sexy, mais ô combien important, la gestion des matières résiduelles. On vient d'adopter notre plan de gestion des matières résiduelles, un plan sur 5 ans, qui a comme objectif de réduire de façon drastique l'enfouissement et le nombre de déchets par ménage. Pour ça, on a créé un nouveau centre de tri à la Chine et on est en train de construire une usine de biométhanisation à partir de résidus alimentaires, donc la production de gaz naturel renouvelable à partir du compost, par exemple. Ce sont des grands projets qui, à l'échelle de la ville, prennent beaucoup de notre énergie, mais qui sont fondamentales pour pouvoir adapter la ville et devenir un acteur efficace de lutte au changement climatique. Il y a aussi le principe de la ville nourricière. Donc, la ville de Montréal est une des villes qui produit le plus de produits alimentaires en son sein. Grâce aux jardins collectifs, aux initiatives communautaires, aux initiatives de la ville aussi, mais notre plein potentiel est loin d'être atteint. Et ça permet de réduire, par exemple, le transport des aliments. Ça amène une plus grande résilience et ça amène une démultiplication des espaces verts aussi. Enfin, il y a toute la question de la planification urbaine, limiter la construction dans certaines zones qui sont maintenant inondables, être capable de l'assumer, de le dire clairement, contrôler le zonage aussi en fonction des nouvelles réalités climatiques. Donc, ce sont tous les espaces d'action qui incombent à l'espace municipal et dont, je pense, toutes les municipalités doivent adresser de façon efficace et ambitieuse. Notre devoir, c'est aussi de faire
je veux juste vous dire qu'il vous reste moins d'1 minute.
J'ai presque terminé.
Parfait, excellent.
Notre devoir, c'est aussi de faire preuve de leadership. En temps de pandémie, on l'a vu, hein, la situation est extrêmement difficile pour tout le monde. Et c'est aussi notre devoir de prendre le relais, de pouvoir dire aux citoyens, on reconnaît que vous êtes débordés, on reconnaît que la situation est extrêmement difficile émotionnellement, économiquement, dans votre quotidien. On est là pour prendre la lutte entre nos mains avec vous, mais on est aussi les leaders qui avons la responsabilité de créer ces espaces de lutte au changement climatique pour que vous puissiez y participer. On a le devoir d'alléger l'anxiété citoyenne et de dire, on est là, on travaille pour vous et on lutte efficacement contre les changements climatiques à la hauteur de notre capacité comme municipalité. Et puis, je pense qu'on doit être honnête aussi, les villes n'ont pas le pouvoir d'agir seules, mais elles ont le devoir de créer des alliances entre les villes au Canada, à travers le monde. Le C40 s'est mis en place il y a quelques années. Le Climate Caucus au Canada existe aussi pour pouvoir faire pression sur les autres paliers de gouvernement de façon concertée et pour pouvoir faire entendre un message clair. Seth a parlé d'un plan de mobilisation. Je pense que ce plan-là doit se faire de façon concertée avec toutes les villes à travers le Canada et les grandes villes ont un devoir de leadership dans ce travail.
Je vous remercie, Madame Parent, il faut vraiment arrêter.
Parfait. Ben alors, on cherche à inspirer avant tout. Et puis, je voulais remercier Seth pour son livre qui est excellent. C'est ma Bible maintenant.
Merci, Marie-Josée. Je vois que M. Vacher, Claude, a allumé sa caméra. Donc, on va y aller avec Claude. Et la question suivante. Donc, Claude, il existe une différence entre un investissement qui cible la transition et un autre qui concerne une action liée à l'action climatique urgente. Il y a l'urgence climatique et il y a la transition, et ce sont deux choses différentes. Je sais que vous êtes spécialisé dans les fonds reliés aux technologies propres, Cycle Capital est un leader. Alors, j'aimerais savoir quelle proportion du portefeuille de Cycle Capital cible vraiment l'urgence climatique.
Bonjour tout le monde, merci Diane et merci beaucoup à la Fondation Mécano de l'invitation à participer. Seth, un excellent livre, un excellent ouvrage qui donne un nouvel angle à comment attaquer le défi des changements climatiques. Bon, comme vous le savez, Cycle Capital est un pionnier dans l'investissement du secteur des technologies propres qui ont un impact sur la réduction des gaz à effet de serre. Cycle a été fondé en 2009 par ma partenaire André-Lise Méthode. Et puis aujourd'hui, on compte 5 fonds, un demi-milliard sous gestion et plus de 40 sociétés dans lesquelles on a investi. La mission de Cycle, c'est d'investir dans des technologies propres, des compagnies qui ont des technologies propres, afin de réussir le défi de l'énergie, de la transition énergétique. On parle ici des secteurs des nouvelles énergies, l'efficacité énergétique, la chimie verte, l'agriculture soutenable, les villes intelligentes et puis la mobilité durable. D'ailleurs, le nom de cycle vient de l'analyse cycle de vie qui est très utile pour pouvoir faire des investissements dans le secteur de l'investissement durable. Je vais démystifier un peu ce qu'on fait juste très rapidement pour passer dans le vif du sujet. On est des investisseurs en capital de risque qui recherchons les entreprises avec des technologies qui ont des solutions aux problèmes qu'on fait face aujourd'hui dans les secteurs de l'énergie, dans le secteur de la chimie verte. Et lorsqu'on trouve une telle entreprise, ben, c'est souvent qu'elle a beaucoup de propriété intellectuelle, il y a une bonne équipe de gestion et on vise à les aider, à les amener à devenir des grands succès parce que ces compagnies-là sont essentielles pour qu'on réussisse la transition, pour arriver à une économie carboneutre d'ici 2050. Je vais vous donner quelques exemples de portefeuilles, d'entreprises en portefeuille, et puis ça va bien illustrer le cas. Enerkem, qui est une compagnie de Montréal, qui est une spécialiste en gazéification, prend les déchets municipaux et en transforme en molécules vertes, qui est le chemin principal d'une nouvelle industrie de la chimie verte. On a actuellement une usine pleine grandeur qui traite les déchets de la ville d'Edmonton et on vise à en construire partout dans le monde. Donc, c'est un grand pas en avant et c'est une nouvelle industrie qui est très prometteuse. Une autre entreprise d'Ottawa, GaN System, est une entreprise de semi-conducteurs qui a développé des transistors qui permettent, entre autres, la gestion des batteries, mais aussi d'avoir des voitures électriques plus performantes, de 10 à 15% de plus de distance, puis permettent aussi de faire des recharges rapides. Donc, qui va faire en sorte qu'ils vont être beaucoup plus attrayantes pour la transition. Une autre entreprise, c'est ISS qui a développé une solution de stockage d'énergie renouvelable parce que le solaire, ça fournit de l'énergie pas nécessairement quand on a besoin. Et il faut que ça soit abordable de le stocker et de le redonner au réseau. Donc, pour revenir à la question, 100% de nos entreprises ont développé des technologies pour la transition. Et puis, ils sont prêts à faire une analogie avec le livre. Ils sont prêts à être les équipementiers pour la technologie de guerre, pour aller au champ de bataille. Et je dirais même plus que nos entrepreneurs sont sur la ligne de front et attendent le signal. Et pour ça, ça va être important que nos gouvernements, et je pense que Seth l'a bien expliqué, que le leadership de cette bataille-là doit venir de nos gouvernements partout sur la Terre.
Mais pour que vos technologies soient des technologies de crise et non pas des technologies de transition, qu'est-ce que ça va prendre? Parce que ce que je comprends, vous me parlez de l'horizon de 2050, vous me parlez de technologies de transition, mais Seth parle de crise puis de côté immédiat. Donc, pour qu'elle se transforme en technologie de crise, est-ce que c'est juste une question gouvernementale d'incitatif ou est-ce que certaines ont le potentiel d'être des technologies de crise et d'autres de transition?
Nos compagnies sont prêtes aujourd'hui à déployer et à faire la transition, donc à adresser la crise. Donc,
okay.
nos compagnies sont là et puis on a certains succès commerciaux, mais on aimerait bien avoir un mouvement d'accélération pour pouvoir déployer. Et dans une guerre, cette guerre-ci, elle va se gagner avec la technologie. La technologie que nos compagnies ont développée, elle est à coût concurrentiel et elle fait en sorte qu'on peut déployer en déplaçant des technologies existantes qui sont polluantes avec des technologies non polluantes et qui sont concurrentielles, qui ne coûteront pas nécessairement plus cher à la population. Donc, ça, c'est très important. Donc, oui, on répond à la crise, mais il faut un mouvement pour déployer.
Qu'est-ce que vous voulez dire par un mouvement? J'aimerais ça que vous expliquiez ce que vous voulez dire.
Bien, aujourd'hui, on ne sent pas une urgence de crise climatique.
Donc, elles ne sont pas assez sollicitées, vos technologies? Est-ce que c'est ça que vous voulez dire?
Bien, il va falloir des donneurs d'ordre pour pouvoir acheter ces technologies, les déployer. On a les outils.
Prêtes.
Ils sont prêtes, ils sont commerciales, ils sont prêtes à justement changer toute notre infrastructure pour pouvoir justement faire la transition et ça va prendre un certain temps. Rien ne se fait en un an.
Mais pour que les donneurs d'ordre soient au rendez-vous, est-ce qu'il faudrait des incitatifs gouvernementaux ou est-ce que c'est une question d'argent ou c'est une question de mentalité?
C'est essentiellement une question de politique gouvernementale et le prix sur le carbone est un bon début. De mettre un prix sur le carbone va faire en sorte que ça rende les technologies propres beaucoup plus concurrentielles parce qu'on paie le vrai prix pour ces technologies-là parce que le carbone est intégré dedans. Et par contre, si on faisait des politiques gouvernementales qui incitaient à plus vendre de voitures en 2030, comme dans certaines provinces ou dans certains États, ou migrer de ne plus faire de production d'électricité au charbon, ça ferait en sorte que les entreprises seront obligées de transitionner vers ces. Donc, les politiques gouvernementales sont essentielles, le leadership gouvernemental est essentiel pour que la transition se produise rapidement.
Donc, si je résume votre propos, en conclusion, ce que vous nous dites, c'est que vous avez les technologies sont disponibles, il faut qu'il y ait des donneurs d'ordre qui les utilisent, qui les requièrent, ces technologies-là, et on revient à ce que c'est dit, ça prend une forme de leadership gouvernemental pour accélérer justement ce que vous parlez de mouvement, c'est ça?
Exactement, un effort de guerre pour aller de l'avant.
Bien, merci beaucoup, Claude.
Merci.
Alors, on va passer à Karel. Karel, êtes-vous là?
Oui.
D'accord. Oui, parfait. Alors, Karel, j'ai une question pour vous. Alors, j'aimerais savoir à quoi ça ressemble un véritable plan d'urgence climatique pour une entreprise. Est-ce qu'on a un employeur québécois qui possède un véritable plan de sortie des énergies fossiles? Parce que si on parle d'urgence, l'urgence, c'est ça. Donc, est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un au Québec qui a ce plan-là?
Oui. Je ne sais pas. Ça doit exister probablement à différents niveaux,
Okay.
mais c'est comme c'est une cible qui est à l'horizon. Hein? Comme, dans le fond, l'objectif, c'est d'arriver à zéro émission en 2050. Juste avant de répondre, je voulais simplement dire que sur ma table de chevet, avec le livre de Seth, j'ai deux autres livres qui sont Les Mémoires de guerre de Winston Churchill et un livre sur les missions Apollo, qui sont vraiment, ça vous donne une idée dans l'état d'esprit dans lequel je suis, c'est-à-dire, on est dans deux situations où il a fallu, pour atteindre des objectifs, mobiliser, dans un cas, l'ensemble de notre économie, c'est un peu ce que Seth nous dit. Dans le cas d'Apollo, à une certaine époque, dans les années 60, c'était 4 du PIB américain qui était consacré, pas 4 des dépenses publiques, là, 4 du PIB qui allait au projet Apollo. Et donc, dans le fond, c'est possible même de mobiliser un 4, un 5, un 10 du PIB dans un objectif comme ça. Et c'est évident qu'on a besoin de l'État comme mobilisateur. Ceci dit, pour revenir aux entreprises, je n'ai pas trouvé d'exemple. Il y a plein d'exemples d'entreprises qui font des bonnes choses. J'essaie de me poser la question, à quoi ça ressemblerait une entreprise qui se serait mise en mode urgence, qui aurait saisi le signal? Donc, la première chose, l'entreprise a établi une cible. Il faut qu'elle ait une cible qui est compatible avec un monde, avec un réchauffement de 1,5 à 2 degrés. Là. Donc, ce qu'on essaie d'atteindre à l'échelle globale. Et essentiellement, une entreprise qui va se dire, en 2050 ou avant, je vais être à zéro émission neutre. Ce n'est pas possible de la même façon dans tous les secteurs. Il y a des secteurs où il n'y a pas les technologies encore. Je pense entre autres aux avions, l'aviation civile. Donc, il faut faire preuve quand même d'imagination. Ensuite, il faut remettre en question, il ne faut pas seulement viser de réduire les émissions de gaz à effet de serre de nos opérations. Oui, il faut le faire, ça c'est important. Mais il faut aussi regarder du côté de nos pratiques commerciales. Tu sais, par exemple, moi, ça ne va pas m'impressionner si Ford ou Chrysler me disent quand on produit des F-150 ou des Dodge Ram, on émet 10 moins d'émissions qu'il y a 5 ans. Le problème, c'est qu'on vend encore ce produit-là à une échelle. C'est pas tout le monde. On s'entend, c'est comme en ce moment, c'est le véhicule le plus vendu au Canada. Et c'est un véhicule qui est vendu parce qu'il est très, très payant pour les entreprises. Ce n'est pas un besoin nouveau tout d'un coup que tout le monde a besoin de ces voitures-là. C'est que les entreprises ont des meilleures marges de profit. Et donc, dans ce cas-ci, et là, on a vraiment un dilemme. Est-ce qu'on vend le produit qui est néfaste pour l'environnement? Parce qu'ils ont des véhicules électriques aussi, mais ils sont moins payants. Et donc, alors, il y a des pratiques commerciales à changer. Puis tant qu'on ne va pas de ce côté-là, il y a quelque chose, fondamentalement, l'entreprise continue d'opérer comme s'il n'y avait pas d'urgence. Ensuite, il faut regarder la stratégie d'affaires. Le leadership doit, l'exemple, le PDG ou la haute direction d'entreprise doit avoir une stratégie d'affaires qui dit, bien écoutez, c'est dans cette direction-là, on va aller vers la transition énergétique et on va devoir aller changer des choses. Je reprends l'exemple de l'automobile. Bien, pas juste la stratégie d'affaires, mais le modèle d'affaires. Une compagnie automobile, ça repose sur un réseau de concessionnaires. Et là, tu as des entreprises qui arrivent comme Tesla ou d'autres qui vont dire non, j'ai plus de réseau de concessionnaires et mon modèle d'affaires ne repose plus sur l'entretien du véhicule. Parce que vous comprenez ce que je veux dire? Et même, on s'en va vers de plus en plus des flottes de véhicules autonomes dans quelques années. Donc, il y a une révision des modèles d'affaires qui se fait souvent du point de vue de l'arrivée de nouvelles technologies. Puis dans le cas qui nous concerne, quand on est du côté des changements climatiques, il va y avoir effectivement des remplacements, par exemple le passage du moteur à combustion vers le moteur électrique. Je prends toujours l'exemple de l'automobile, parce que je pense que c'est un exemple qui illustre bien les choses. Mais en énergie aussi, on a vu arriver, par exemple, la production d'énergie distribuée. Par exemple, la compagnie qui va installer des panneaux solaires sur votre maison, qui ne vous demandera pas de payer les panneaux solaires, elle utilise l'espace, la superficie de votre toit pour produire une électricité qu'elle vous vend. Et donc, vous, dans le fond, vous avez tout bénéfice parce que vous allez payer votre électricité moins cher, puis vous n'avez pas besoin d'investir dans l'achat de l'infrastructure. Mais ces compagnies-là qui arrivent, ils attaquent directement le monopole, les monopoles naturels ou les monopoles des grandes utilities aux États-Unis. Et donc, là, Hydro-Québec a vu ça venir. Et Hydro-Québec s'est dit, ben écoutez, c'est la spirale de la mort parce qu'éventuellement, ces compagnies-là vont entrer sur le marché au Québec. Pas maintenant parce que l'électricité n'est pas chère au Québec. Ce n'est pas nécessairement ici que ça va se faire en premier. Mais quand ça va arriver, ça va se répandre. Et plus on perd de clients, plus on va devoir augmenter les clients restants, puis on entre dans une spirale de la mort. Hydro-Québec l'a compris il y a quelques années. Et là, ils viennent de lancer Hilo, qui est leur nouvelle filiale qui va faire de la domotique et tout ça. Donc, ils sont en train...
je veux juste vous dire qu'il reste 1 minute.
Parfait. Donc, eux transforment leur modèle d'affaires tranquillement. Ils sont en train de bâtir le nouveau modèle d'affaires pour occuper un nouveau marché. Donc, je donne ici plein d'exemples d'entreprises qui font des changements, mais fondamentalement, il faut être capable d'aller réfléchir à ces pratiques commerciales, d'où va venir notre croissance. Et si la croissance continue de venir des secteurs qui sont à haute intensité carbone ou qui encouragent les consommations à haute intensité carbone, à ce moment-là, on a beau dire qu'on va réduire nos émissions de 10 ou de 20 ça n'aura pas d'impact. Donc, il faut être prêt à aller beaucoup plus loin que ça. J'ai vu peu d'entreprises le faire. Il y en a qui étaient dans le charbon, des grandes compagnies. La Caisse de dépôt a investi dans des grandes compagnies de charbon, d'électricité en Inde, qui vont se convertir graduellement pour sortir complètement du thermique et des énergies fossiles. Il y en a donc qui le font, mais je pense que ça demeure une minorité et qu'il y a une frilosité parce que, effectivement, on manque de leadership de la part peut-être de l'État. Je pense que l'État doit donner une direction. Moi, je rejoins Claude là-dessus.
Puis vous parlez aussi, si je résume, vous parlez beaucoup aussi des pratiques d'affaires. Donc, de dire, je vais réduire de 10 mes émissions, mais de garder des pratiques d'affaires qui encouragent, bien, il y a comme une dichotomie à quelque part. On n'y arrive pas.
C'est comme la compagnie de cigarettes qui dirait, tu sais, je mets moins de pesticides dans mes champs, mais je vends des cigarettes à des adolescents. Là. C'est pas,
je comprends.
Ça ne règle pas le problème.
Bon, bien, merci Claude, merci Marie-Josée, merci Karel. On va retourner à Seth. Back to you, Seth. You can put your mic and your camera on so we can hear you. Hi, Seth. So we can hear you react to those 3 panelists. How do you see those comments? How do you put them in perspective with your book or your mindset?
Well, my thanks to all of them, and thank you for your kind words, and thank you thank you for your kind words about the book, Carl. I'm very happy to hear about your bedtime book collection, and these are all important initiatives. Marie-Josée, by the way, I mentioned Marie-Josée in my book as one of a number of climate champions that should be supported in the political domain, and her colleagues in Climate Caucus. That's really important. I guess my response, maybe I'll try to, well, first of all, with respect to cities, as Marie-Josée said, there are important things cities can do around waste management, around bike paths, around community design itself, creating complete communities where people can live and work within a walk and a roll for everything that they need, and so on. I would emphasize again the importance of buildings. And where the city does have some ability, it depends, each jurisdiction's rules are a bit different. I mentioned how Vancouver has done these 2 things, right? They've said no new buildings can use gas as of next year. And then by 2025, all replacements of heaters have to be not gas. Those 2 measures alone, in all part of a much larger climate plan, are responsible for half of the GHG reductions in their IPCC targets as a city. So the building piece is huge. And on the infrastructure piece, this is where it's very challenging for cities, because whether it's transit infrastructure or other climate infrastructure, they really need the help of the federal government. The federal government has the capacity to spend with the assistance of the Bank of Canada, as we've seen in this pandemic, in a way that other levels of government do not. I think just to wrap together a response to Claude and Carl, again, I keep coming back to the mandates, right? There's such important work happening in the domain of clean tech, but in the end, it's marginal. And the question in all of this is, how do we scale it up and take that which is marginal and make it universal and the norm? And that has to be state-led. And price signals alone will not achieve that. Actually mandating things will achieve that scale in the realm of vehicles, for example. So I should say, Quebec does have ZEV mandates, so does my province in British Columbia, but the dates are too far out. We should do like other European countries are starting to do and say to all of the dealers and manufacturers, come 2025, you won't be able to buy a fossil fuel car, that's it. And that would drive change in the market at a scale that I was trying to give you a flavor for in the Second World War. But ultimately, that society-wide mobilization needs to be state-led. And in some ways, I heard both Cal and Claude saying that. And maybe I would just say this in conclusion, if I may. This pandemic has all shown us how quickly this stuff can happen, and how quickly our governments can pivot and start to treat things as emergencies. What I've tried to do in this historical excavation of our wartime experience is really just blow open our sense of possibility and ambition. This to me is actually the most nefarious legacy of neoliberalism. It's not the tax cuts and the spending cuts and the deregulation. It's that it sapped our imagination and our ambition about what's possible. I'll say maybe I'll try to close with two observations about World War II. One is, we live in a difficult time, where in a very ambiguous time, we don't know if we can do this in time on climate. That's the truth. But I like to remind people that when all those million+ Canadians enlisted to fight fascism 80 years ago, they also didn't know if they would win. We know how that story ended, but they did not. And there was a few years in which the outcome was very much an open question, and they did what they had to do regardless. And, I make a point in the conclusion of the book that, not to give away the ending, although we all know how it ends, a lot of us who have a kind of nerdy interest in World War II or other pivotal historic moments, like Cal clearly does from his book collection, we look back on those things and we think, what would I have done if I had lived then and there? Mm-hmm. But the answer to that question is not really a mystery. The answer to that question is whatever we're all ready to do now.
Well, Seth, there are two things I want to take with me from that conversation with you. First, that crisis lift impossible barriers. That was the beginning of your talk, and it sticks with me. And the other one is from marginal to universal. The fact that, like Claude said, technologies are there, but we feel like still marginal. We need people to buy them. We need to have a momentum. So crisis needs to take us from margin to the universal, to the norm, from the margin to the norm. So thank you, Seth, for this great conversation. And I will turn the mic to Annie. Annie, c'est à vous le micro pour nous dire quelques mots de clôture.
Juste un grand remerciement à tout le monde qui s'est joint à nous ce soir, qui a participé à cette conversation très intéressante. Un grand merci à Désirée McGrath, à Marie-Josée Parent, Karel et Claude de s'être joints à nous. Diane, un grand merci à toi d'avoir animé cette conversation et d'avoir posé plein de bonnes questions qui nous ont inspirés ce soir. Aussi un grand merci à toute l'équipe de Copticom pour le support technique et toute l'organisation logistique de cet événement. Seth, I can only wish you that we all heed the important historical lessons that you offer in this book, and that you give us the courage to be bold, to mobilize all sectors of society against what I think is the biggest threat to climate action, which is incrementalism, as you've mentioned, that we need really to mobilize on a scale and a level that warrants the science and the climate crisis that we face. So thank you so much.
Alors, d'habitude, à ce moment-ci des événements que j'anime, je souhaite un bon retour à la maison à tout le monde. Mais cette fois-ci, c'est difficile parce que tout le monde est déjà à la maison. Donc, il me reste à vous souhaiter une bonne heure de souper agréable avec tous ceux que vous aimez autour de vous. Et puis, probablement parce qu'on a tous des gens qu'on aime dans notre vie, ça risque peut-être de nous faire réfléchir au rôle qu'on devrait jouer pour essayer de stopper cette crise avant qu'il soit trop tard. Alors, bonne soirée à tout le monde et merci à tous les participants qui sont restés avec nous jusqu'à la fin. Au revoir.